And we are back with APIM Hotrod. That's the episode 6. Stephane, how are you?
Fine, Massimo, and you? What's up?
Life is busy and busy good. So it's nice to have this chat with you. And we have a little news with for the people that are following us, the people that are watching this show. Last week we introduced a new little website for looking to keeping track of our journey with APIM Hotrod. And here is the here is the link, apimhotrod.cloud, and it's a small website here where we explain why we started this show. And here we are tracking our journey that is started with all of our episode. Today we are recording the episode number 6, and we will have some milestone throughout our journey all the way to end of the year, where we will for sure celebrate the 10 years of GA for API management. We are also via this website opening our let's say show with external guests, because more people the better. So if you want to talk about the aspect that you love the most, please submit your talk or your topic with Sessionize. And here, as I was saying, we are tracking some milestone, like the first episodes, and new milestone will come up in the coming weeks, in the coming months. Okay, so this is our brand new website, but now let's switch back to the wonderful Polar Star, the mind map created by Stephane. Last time we talked about publish, so the different style that we might use for publishing our virtual APIs in the gateway. Today we will talk about scaling, right? A topic I love the most.
Indeed. So quite an interesting topic, yeah, Massimo. So I would say that basically, Massimo, are you still there?
Yes, I just
Okay.
temporarily switched back. I'm sorry.
No problem. I was just not sure if you lost connection or not. So anyway, so yeah, scaling, it's indeed a nice topic. And I would say that to start with, we should actually envision scaling in two ways, right? Scaling compute-wise, so meaning that at some point you have a single API that would need to scale because it has a heavy workload, right? So you need to scale it from a compute perspective. But it's also scaling in terms of how many APIs you have, right? Independently of how they are consumed. You might have many APIs, you might have different types of APIs, B2B, B2E, B2C, you see, so with different audiences. That's another way to scale, right? So that's scale, and then you need to scale in terms of manageability and scale, of course, in terms of compute. So, and that's actually what I tried as well to represent a bit in the let's say in the map, but it's actually hard to reflect or to show about the manageability aspects in this one. But that's why I'm highlighting this to say, okay, scaling, you have to see both sides of the coin, let's say, so compute wise, but also from a number of APIs perspective. Um, so maybe, of course, one obvious way to scale is to use caching. That would be, for instance, of course, in terms of compute, to speed up things. Whenever you can use caching, APIM as a built-in cache, so that you can, of course, use. It's always possible to add an external cache. Typically, it's going to be Redis. And so the advantage, of course, of an external cache is that you will go beyond the limits of built-in cache, which varies according to pricing tier. But also you could share that cache across different APIMs or across APIMs and something else, right? So that's a bit the
And
flexibility
exactly,
you have.
the two things, like one is sharing cost, and the other things of manageability, right? So the built-in cache, one of the side effects is that manageability. If you want to refresh the cache and all of these kind of things, it's a little bit complex and not optimal, right?
Yeah, let's say the built-in cache is really hidden somehow. So the only way indeed to manipulate it is through the policies, right? While of course Redis is just a full standalone service which is attached in this case to APIM, but of course you have other ways to interact with Redis. So indeed, you have more flexibility and also more options. So in terms of which Redis you want to use. So, but of course, it comes at a cost. While the built-in cache is, of course, integrated in the pricing tier that you take. So I would say for simple scenarios, built-in cache often does the job. Now, if you start having hundreds of APIs and you have, let's say, advanced requirements, then probably the external cache would be a better choice in that case.
Can we see it like more a level one, level two cache, like one is in memory and the other one out of processor?
Yeah, so yeah, I would say for sure Redis is definitely a distributed cache system, right? So which you use also for your application. So I would say if you already have Redis, because sometimes also people have don't know Redis, right? It's not yet in use in the company, but it's less and less frequent, but that's still it can still happen. So if you already use that for your own developments and your outside of just APIs, then of course it makes sense to say, okay, we can extend the use of Redis to APIM as well. But yeah, so be aware that you have both options. And for simple scenarios, if you don't use Redis yet and so on, then you might just stick to the built-in one. So it is there at least. So that's yeah, that's something to know basically. And that's one way to scale. But to scale mostly about for instance, absorb more load without performance degradation, of course, because caching is, yeah, you avoid round trips to the backend service or ultimately to maybe to a data store. Yeah, that's basically and of course, the downside of caching is that, of course, then you deal with stale data. So potentially, you need to accept, let's say, to have potentially data that is not the most fresh data, of course, like every cache system. I don't know if you want to add anything to this, Massimo, about caching.
Uh,
Massimo?
sorry, Stefan, I had a little bit a problem on the line. Come again?
Yeah, no, did you want to add something about caching?
No, no, no. I you cover perfectly, and like I mean, I went to the question right, right on when you were on that point. So I will move up on this AI high availability more
Yeah,
in this case from infrastructure or yeah, and then auto scaling options or scaling the gateway.
yeah, indeed. So let's move on to this one. So, uh, you want to share something about it, or you want me to go ahead on the high
Yeah,
availability?
just go ahead. Then I will
Yeah,
take it. I will take it
good.
up later.
Yeah. Okay, good. So basically, one way to scale, of course, is to add gateway units, right? So, and of course, when you add gateway units, it's always good to, at the same time, try to increase the resilience. Yeah, so that's why actually I have mixed somehow both topics here. That hybrid is also under scaling because, of course, if you say that you are in West Europe and you have today one gateway unit, you need a second gateway unit, then of course a way to achieve this is by simply adding gateway units into another zone, right? So in West Europe, all the hero regions typically have multiple availability zones. So then of course it's a good idea to envision this at the same time that you scale so that you have both more compute but also a better resilience because you spread your gateway units across zones. That's one way to scale. Another way to scale is actually at locations, and locations somehow it's regions as well. So in APIM, when you have a multi-region APIM instance, then you will add locations which ultimately will be regions, and you can combine both, so multi-region and multi-zone. So you could perfectly have three gateway units in each region, like West Europe, North Europe, and of course across the three of these zones. So it means six gateway units in this case. Of course, you will have to pay accordingly, so pay attention to this. But as of the second gateway unit, you pay, I think, half of the price of the first one, right? So you don't pay the same price for all the gateway units. So the most expensive one is actually the first one, but still it represents some costs. But that's, let's say, one way to scale is to anyway add gateway units, and at the same time trying to spread them across zones and across regions, just to also increase the resilience at the same time.
But there's also a little bit like a change in the way that we do high availability compared to the past. So in the past, there were no the concept of availability zones. So like in this case, suppose 3 gateways or more, 5 gateways or units, if you prefer, within a single location. And but right now that we can achieve availability, high availability this way, having a multi-region, not multi-location in the same availability zone, is more a business need to reach, for latency reasons, to reach our audience, most probably, rather than an high availability requirements, right?
Yeah, for multi-region, yes. So of course that could be multi-region is also about disaster recovery. So again, that's also a way to scale, and at the same time, if you have like an active multi-region APIM instance, then somehow, but you are also resilient against disaster, at least an outage over one region. No, indeed, you need to think about the whole chain. So meaning, indeed, if you have a multi-region setup, but let's say it's you cannot do that just with APIM. If you do this, then you have just a single backend. You see what I mean? So in
Yeah,
West Europe, then you would have indeed cross-region traffic, and so that's of course not something you should do, because you would have increased latency. By the way, same applies to availability zones. So if you have all the latency is much smaller, still a round trip across availability zones is about 2 milliseconds, and that
yeah,
might sound silly, but I've seen, well, I will not name the application in this case, but it's a well-known product. And that one, just to launch the homepage, it was performing more than 1,000 calls to the database, right? And so what they had in that setup is that the compute, so the backend services were in zone A, for instance, zone one, but the database was in zone two, right? And so for these 1,000 calls or more than 1,000 calls, actually they had a latency of about 15 seconds, right? So just to load the page, you had 50 seconds delay, 15 seconds delay because of those round trips. Of course, because the application was a poor, as a poorly developed, right? But yet this extra 2 milliseconds per round trip ultimately really increase the latency. So of course, when you spread, you scale, and at the same time you try to be more resilient, you have to think about the end-to-end, let's say, chain and where your backends are, and also try to spread your backends across zones and so on, so that you have an end-to-end, let's say, resilient story with the same level of latency. Yeah. So
yeah. So
uh,
zone redundancy, it's
yeah,
also extremely important. The overall picture, as also the
indeed.
backend zone redundancy. Otherwise, we will have
Indeed.
all-
And if indeed you can't afford this for whatever reason, then indeed you'd better add units in the same zone in that case, right? Same zone as your backends, to make sure that, okay, you will not especially increase resilience. I mean, if one zone is down, then okay, you lose your 2 units, for instance, but at least you will first scale. So you have 2 different units, and latency will not be impacted. So it's always a question of trade off. So if you can afford to scale and at the same time increase resilience, but see that from a holistic standpoint, it's always the best choice. But if for some reason you can't have everything across zones, then of course put everything in the same zone, just to make sure that you don't have latency issues. And again, that can depend on the specific API, specific systems that you have. That varies from, of course, one use case to another. So it's not that you can have a golden rule that will always work, right? Whatever situation. Yeah, so, but indeed, if you have
okay.
cross ability zone round trips, that's going to be 2 milliseconds.
That's
Um,
cool. That's cool. And we might now also talk about the scaling, for example, of the gateway per se. What you have here, the auto scaling option, which I believe is
yeah,
the most common and most discussed, one of the most discussed topics at
yeah,
customers, right? So
yeah,
a classic scale out, not a scale up in the sense of I'm moving
indeed.
from a specific tier to a different tier, like from standard, for example, to premium, but
Yeah,
just like adding units to our API management instance. Here
yeah,
I see that there are the two example, like
yeah,
the rather slow and the
yeah,
fast. Let's start the fast one that is because of a completely different technology, right? A
indeed.
managed gateway, so the one that is in the cloud,
Yeah.
versus the self-hosted that we can put on our Kubernetes
Yeah.
infrastructure or Azure Container Apps if you want. And
Yeah.
over there, it's self-hosted. It's all based on HPA and VPA or whatever kind
Yeah.
of scaling technology we might use on that hosting platform.
Yeah.
And then we have the classic one, what is a rather slow, and then I'm coming for with a question for you, where we have potentially auto scaling. So let's look at example on the case of the single tenant tier, so the
Yeah.
classic premium, the one that is so far the most used,
Mhm.
where you might or customer or a lot of customer, I suppose they are scaling based on capacity. There is a
Mhm.
capacity matrix,
Yeah.
and then you can
Yeah.
auto scale based on that matrix. But in my experience, that kind of auto scale was extremely slow.
Yeah,
And
that's why I was kind enough to say rather slow, but this is extremely slow, right?
yeah,
I
like
didn't
I,
want to
I had
offend
an
anyone,
example. Yeah,
so
no,
yeah,
I had an
yeah,
example of this
yeah,
customer that have a, okay, the use case is very easy. Like they have
mm,
some peaks, suppose at Wednesday, 1 p.m.
yeah.
Suppose
But
like,
that's
and
an easier scenario, yeah. But
I
I'll
know
let
that
you
it's
finish. But
easy,
yeah,
but
yeah,
the
yeah,
problem is over there, it's an easy scenario. So we just scale on based on time.
time,
I
yeah, yeah,
I schedule a pipeline and I call the SZCLI and I
yeah,
bring it to 3 instances premium, and
yeah,
then I bring up to down to 1 instance.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the problem is also the auto scale per se it takes so much time
yeah.
that also if my peak is at suppose at 1 p.m. I have to
Mm.
scale 2 hours before
Yeah,
or one
indeed,
hour
yeah,
before. No,
indeed, yeah.
it's
But
really
yeah, no, indeed, that's really and APIM is extremely slow to scale, but it's not the only one. For instance, if you also use app service, right? If you take the ASC, the app service environment, let's say the V3, which already is better, V3 takes about 13 minutes, 1 3, to scale, right? To add another instance, which is also very, very, very slow, of course. So if you really need to scale because of high, if you have unpredictable peaks, then you cannot use that. Let's be clear, because of course the time it takes to scale, your peak is already gone, and maybe you already reached full capacity for too long, and you're gonna be in a mess already. If you have indeed predictable peaks, that's still doable. As you said, okay, you need to be to take some margin, make sure that you scale upfront, but at least it's doable, and still you can still it can still be cost effective, right? Because then you say, okay,
yeah.
you will pay maybe 3 hours a day, 2 gateway units, and then only one gateway unit for the
You
non-peak
said
time, so that's fine. Yeah,
you said
tell
the
me.
keyword cost effective.
Yeah,
I believe that that metric basic scaling on the single tenant API management instances is not at all cost effective. It cannot be cost effective, right?
no,
Or
but it's no, no, but or at least it will be more cost effective than running 2 gateway units all the times. You see, so if
yeah,
you have
that's
particularly
for sure.
yeah, you see, so if you say every day at 1 p.m. You have a peak, and then you scale, you make sure that it's already ready at, let's say, 12:30, and then you scale in at 3, then okay, you will pay 2 gateway units for 2 hours instead of 24. So it's still better than having those two
Yeah,
gateway units running all the time, but it's only with predictable peaks that you can do that. And that's still, of course, doable depending on the business, geographies, and so on. But indeed, it's not. That's why I said rather slow. But today, that's a bit what it is. So,
yeah.
um,
And you know
yeah,
what? And in cloud architecture, the game is to use the resources that you have
yeah.
as much as possible. So I agree with you what you're saying, but it still hurts the fact that is not we cannot optimize more than this auto scaling, right?
At
But
least not with that tier, indeed. So, of course, as you mentioned, that's okay. That's applicable to the premium tier. Now, if you would take serverless tier, then it's fine, right? But then, of course, with the serverless tier, you can forget about VNet and so on. So, but yet we don't know who is watching. So, if you would have if you don't have really strong security requirements and so on, you might just be able to use the serverless tier, and in that case, it's of course much easier, right? Because then, okay, it will scale according to the actual need, also up to some limits, of course, like everything in serverless. But yeah, you see, and that's of course quite fast to scale, of course. But that's another tier.
Yeah, and
Pricing,
let me
yeah,
say,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, sorry if I interrupt you, but you said something very important. So the real difference is between the single tenant infrastructure or a platform versus the multi-tenant platform. So
Yeah.
API management has two type of platform or two type of architecture or setup: a
Mhm.
single tenant and the multi-tenant. So all the V2 tiers are multi-tenant plus the consumption. So in that case, it can scale way much
Faster.
faster.
Yeah,
And the example of the V2, unfortunately, today you can scale it up, but there is no auto scaling. So if you are using a basic or a standard
yeah.
V2,
Me too.
and in
Yeah.
the future when there will be premium V2, I suppose over there the auto scaling will be better, hopefully. Um, but in that case, standard and basic, we have to build up, or you have to build up something by yourself. So I don't know, just
Yeah.
how would you do? You will
Actually, what you mentioned, so if you say, okay, a pipeline would actually kick in, but then it's only time-based, right? Because if you really need capacity-based, yeah, I think I never thought about this one, but you might try to, yeah, have to monitor the metric and try to trigger something. But the time
exactly.
still, yeah, that would be a way, of course. But in any case, indeed, you cannot rely on the auto-scaling plan itself. You would have to build something that will add the unit and let's say remove a unit as
Yeah.
needed. So,
Of course,
which is
we
also not
all
ideal.
hope it will be a built-in scaling, but yeah, the easiest way you just you just catch an alert or
Yeah,
you catch some metrics in with Azure Monitor, and then you call a function, you call
yeah, to
whatever
to to do the
endpoint
job.
that
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
yeah that will
What I
trigger.
would, because I'm not sure if we have anything about, no, I was thinking about Event Grid, but I don't think we have anything in the system topics that could help in that. But okay, that would need to be checked further. But definitely we need to build something yourself. So ideally, if the service could evolve in such a way that you would have something similar to Elastic Premium in functions, you see, so that's really scaling fast and so on, that would be, of course, ideal. That you have a very dynamic tier that still come with also VNet integration and so on, because that's anyway today kind of a very common requirement. But yeah, and so, but that's why I still put the Kubernetes flavor, so the self-hosted gateway flavor, because actually, so initially, and I explained that, we explained that in another episode, but initially the use case of the self-hosted gateway is, let's say, to cover non-Azure traffic. So you have, for instance, a backend service on-prem that needs to talk to another backend service on-prem, and you want an API gateway in between, and you don't want to have a round trip to the cloud. That's the use case of the self-hosted gateway. But of course, you can still, if you have a large Kubernetes footprint in the cloud, then you might as well say, okay, we start adding gateway units as well in Kubernetes, because that, first, it's much cheaper than the Microsoft managed gateway unit. That's one. And secondly, of course, that scales much faster because it's just pod replicas, and indeed with HBAs, it's really a matter of seconds. So that's no, and yet you can also leverage availability zones, for instance, with AKS, right? And also have gateway units running in different zones, and that's the cost you pay per deployment, so not per unit, right? So meaning that you can really have a very cost-effective thing. And so if you already use Kubernetes, let's say a lot in the company, then it makes sense to think about that option as well.
And to close, because we are at 23 minutes,
Yeah,
it's also, and I also like that use case that you are explaining. But at the end, it all boils down on feature parity, yes or no, between the self-hosted gateway and the managed gateway, or what do you
yeah,
need in for your customer scenarios. And also for customers that they don't want to afford all the complexity of Kubernetes, but they want to leverage the scenario that we are saying. You can also host the self-hosted in Azure Container Apps that makes everything simple. You have, as you were mentioning, VNet integration. You have high availability zones, and all of these kind of things. And the scaling for sure is pretty fast.
Yeah.
Okay, that we could continue talking about scaling for another hour or so, and even more. It's a very important, of course, topic and a topic that I like really a lot in
Just
cloud.
maybe one last thing before we close, because that's
Go
an
ahead.
anecdote from the field. So, as I told you, you need to scale, think about compute, but also think about number of APIs, right? And so a single instance cannot host that many APIs. That's something to consider. So if you, for instance, have a shared API management instance, don't think that you will host thousands of APIs on that one, because I already had customers where the full capacity was reached, although there was zero consumption on the gateway, just by the number of APIs that were hosted there. Because when you deploy those APIs, then each gateway unit will need to load memory, the configuration, right? And if it's too massive, then you will actually saturate the capacity just by the configuration. So that's something to keep an eye on, right? Make sure to know, so make sure to spread your APIs accordingly to different instances if you really have a massive amount of APIs in the company, right? That's something to, and so one unit of segregation that I always try to apply anyway is do not mix B2B APIs with B2E. So APIs for your own organization with B2B, so with partners, and with B2C. Try to at least already split at instance level for this, and then yet try to envision how many APIs you have in total, right? Independently of on how often they will be consumed or what's the load of the APIs themselves, right? That's also something you need to
Yeah.
consider before to scale, let's say.
And actually, starting from the audience, like the classic external, internal,
Yeah,
and partner APIs is always it's a natural step also for designing APIs,
yeah,
and also if you apply the same thing,
yeah.
so the same concept also in architecture, it is beneficial at the end of the day.
Indeed. No, indeed. But there is a temptation often to mix all APIs on the same to spare money, right? To
Yeah,
try. So there's some customers are tempted to regroup everything and then split on the, with the pass-based rules so that internal APIs are not exposed. But yet you have to think about manageability as well beyond cost. But with that, we can close the episode, Massimo. Otherwise, it's gonna be too long.
yeah. Okay, so it was a very nice episode, as always, very interesting chatting with you, Stefan. So I hope
Same.
it was a good one for our audience. And thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you,
yeah, see you
Massimo.
next time.
Talk to you soon. Happy
Bye
scaling.
bye.
See you.